Hello, everyone. So today, joining me is Dr. Nicholas Ladany from the US. He's currently president-elect. He's starting his position, and congratulations on that. So
Thank
he'll
you.
be president of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia. And before that, he was the dean of. Currently, he's the dean of School of Leadership and Education in San Diego, and he's also working as an associate provost for academic outreach program. And before that, he was the dean of School of Education and Psychology at Santa Clara University, and he also has around 80 publications and around 250 presentations on topics of leadership and higher education. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah,
And
it's
I
always
guess everywhere in this new virtual space that we're all in.
yes, and it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. I want to start with the. Uh, when you first assumed a leadership role in your career, it was your first role. What was one thing that you found that it was really something that helped you fit into that role and get comfortable?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. My background, I'm trained as a psychologist. And, anytime anyone gets in any new type of role, we kind of fall back on the skills that may come more naturally to us and certainly that we're trained in. And for me, that was the interpersonal skills. And in particular, empathizing or empathy or demonstrating understanding of others, having compassion toward others. And as a leader, what I've learned is actually I use my interpersonal skills even to this day more than any other leadership trait that I've learned over the years.
So we hear this word empathy a lot, and so if we try to exercise empathy, it's a lot of it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of listening. It's a lot of understanding. It's not being in your head, but really being present for the other person. So I forgot to introduce that you also have a PhD in psychology, and you have done a lot of work in psychology as well. How did knowing psychology or doing your PhD or your studies in psychology help you develop that trait of empathy?
So I think some of it comes from, how we grew up, and learning how to understand others and feeling comfortable in that role of trying to understand others. And as a psychologist, what we're trained to do is to do a lot of active listening, which is sometimes counter to what we're used to. So to even just sit silent sometimes can be incredibly powerful in interpersonal interaction. But really just to listen, hear what people are saying, and not just what they're telling you, but also what they may mean by it. So if they say everything is okay, if you're in a leadership position and you're working with someone who reports to you and they say, oh, everything's fine, really quick, or they might say something that tips them off that really not everything is okay. Just stepping back and saying, I'm hearing you, everything is okay, but it seems like something else is going on. Do you feel comfortable sharing with me? And giving them that space to really talk about what might be going on, which then can be helpful for me as a leader to help me make decisions in other contexts or to make change in an organization, for example.
Okay. And when you talk about interpersonal skills, what would you categorize as those skills? So listening, understanding, are there any other skills that, so a lot of the audience that we have are either law students or they are practicing lawyers. And with lawyers in Pakistan, especially students who do a University of London degree with us or with any other institute in Pakistan, they get this opportunity to start their law firm really early in their career. So we have lawyers who are 27, 28, and they are partners in law firms. They have started their own law firms, and then they are accidental leaders. They are in the position where they are managing people, where they are managing clients, and the courts, and it's a highly charged environment. So that's why we wanted to have this talk. So Maybe if you can talk more about interpersonal skills, especially in a role where there's a lot of communication that happens.
Sure. So a couple things, as you point out, listening. There's something called minimal encouragers, which you kind of have to have patience, and the use of patience and silence is important. But if you just go, or tell me more, or go on, oftentimes those small encouragers can get people to talk about what might be happening. I think the other thing that's very useful, and attorneys and lawyers, they're the counselors. They're often called counselors, and because they really do counsel, but part of counseling is listening and then paraphrasing back. So another skill that's critical is being able to hear what you're saying or hear what someone is saying, paraphrase it back to them, and make sure that you've got it right. That's kind of empathy, but there's a bit of reflecting back what people are thinking and saying, but also what they might be feeling. So it's a tricky area to get into. I understand lawyers are not therapists, but there is a time when you empathize with the feelings that someone's experiencing. If there's a trauma, or if there's something that's fueling them, just by identifying those feelings, but also reflecting back what they're saying and thinking, can be healing, but also can kind of bring down the level of emotion, or the level of I guess the intensity of the interaction. Because sometimes as an attorney, you don't want your clients to be all riled up and on the border of not being able to contain it. You want people to be a little bit more cool-headed, but you can get them to be more cool-headed by managing them in that context. And they're similar with people that work for you, or if you're managing a broader group of folks, if you're managing other attorneys, how do you get, listening to them, reflecting back, paraphrasing, and those kinds of things can help also build an alliance of trust with them. Because when you do all that, you build trust. And when you build trust, you're better able to implement change or implement policies and procedures that work for everybody.
I'm glad that you mentioned trust. So I was working with University of California, and I was commuting from Santa Clara to San Francisco. So I was working at Parnassus Avenue, and I talked to this. So there was this German CEO. She was in the US for a job, and I asked her that, tell me, what is one trait or one thing that you think is essential? You are a CEO, you're a person of influence. And she said, I can only work if I trust people. If I don't trust them, then I cannot work with them. Mm-hmm. So what I'm asking you is beyond that. And so how do you develop that trust with your employees, with your colleagues, with your clients, with the judge, I would say?
Absolutely. Well, there's a concept that I use quite a lot. It comes out of therapy and psychology, and it's the idea of a working alliance. So in a working alliance, you can boil it down to really two key features. One is what we already talked about, which is empathy, and the feature, the construct or concept, the subconcept of the alliance is an emotional bond. That emotional bond is done through empathy. It's created through empathy. It's created through listening, all the things we talked about. But the second feature that's really critical, and by the way, I should say it's a mutual bond. So it's not just one person feels it and the other doesn't. They both have to feel it in order for that element of the alliance to be there. The second feature of the alliance, which people sometimes forget, is a mutual agreement on the goals and tasks. And what that means is, what are our goals in our relationship? If it's an attorney, if it's with a judge, what are the goals here? What are we really trying to accomplish, and how are we going to accomplish it? If we believe one thing and the person we're working with believes another, that disconnect diminishes or weakens the alliance. But if we can get on the same page, if we can say, you know what, our goal is to best serve our client, is to make sure that if there is a settlement, that we find a compromise, we find a point where we can get together and find that, you know what, it was a win-win in a way, or we both agreed that this is where we needed to head. Your outcomes are much better under those circumstances. If you both agree about something different, or you have a different kind of what you think is the outcome and what he or she thinks is the outcome, that's where that weak alliance creates more problems. So that the concept of the alliance, the emotional bond, and the agreement on the task, a mutual agreement on the tasks and goals, those are the critical pieces. And what we know in a lot of different relationships, whether it's counseling, it could be teaching, it can be advising, the alliance is the best predictor of outcome, more predictive than any other method. It doesn't almost matter the method. If you agree that we're going to do it this way and we both have a bond, we'll get there. And that's what's critical as a leader. If you can create these alliances or these working alliances, I think that's the gold standard for any leader in any context.
So if I understand, so if you're creating that working alliance, empathy or listening and that emotional bond, if you're a good listener, if you understand your colleagues or your employees and you work closely with them, they'll reciprocate that. But when you talk about mutual agreement and trust on goals, how do you so as a leader, you have a vision and you are looking at a certain aspect so sure your goals are aligned with your vision, but your colleagues or your subordinates, they might not have the same vision. So how do you get them on the same page? How do you develop that mutual agreement with them?
Well, you've identified it. Just because a leader has a vision on something we're going to do, if you don't have folks, your subordinates or your people that are working with you or for you on the same page, you won't get there, because they will invariably either consciously or unconsciously sabotage the process. So another piece of leadership that's very critical is having voice among the folks in your organization to make sure that they have voice, or they have a sense of shared voice in decisions and future visions. So if you can get them on the same page, and you know, it doesn't have to be identical. I mean, we all want to row together. No one's going to agree with every aspect of a vision. But if you can get all of us to agree with most of it, that's when you make progress. And so I think that's the piece that's so critical, is negotiating the goals, listening to different voices. You know, as a leader, one of the critical things for me is to have people who work with me, for me, however you want to call it, tell me what they think and not feel uncomfortable being honest. I don't need yes people around me or people that just agree with what I say. When that happens, usually there are mistakes that are about to happen that no one's telling because they're afraid to say something to the leader, and then the leader steps in or slips on a banana because by and large, we've not been told, or we have blind spots, and we all have blind spots. And it's really hard sometimes for leaders to have that openness to hearing feedback that may be counter to what we believe. But I think it's critical in creating more opportunities for success and less opportunities for failure when you have that kind of relationship.
So in Pakistan, we have this the image of a leader is very inspirational. It's like leading the flock, inspiring, motivating. But as I hear from you, what you gather is that instead of people following the leader, they should be able to communicate and communicate openly, and so they can help the leader avoid the blind spots. So has this been the case in the US before, or is this the case right now as well in with some leaders that they would allow people to be allow yes people to be around them, and instead of that they'll be listening and avoiding those blind spots?
Yeah, I think one of the things we haven't had much time to talk about yet, but I think is important, I do want to address this, is the cultural differences. And there are cultural differences around the world and how leadership is looked at. And so I'm looking at a very westernized model. However, I will say that one advantage of the US is it brings so many different cultures together that by and large, kind of that American stereotype of kind of this independent, strong leader that's just going to move forward and bring everyone along with her or him is also a stereotype. And what we've learned is from other cultures is we can't just do that. It's not effective. That we can certainly have, you have to have, I guess, all characteristics of a leader are better than just one or two. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You can be a symbolic, inspirational leader, someone who tells stories and gets people all going. That's great. But there's times when you can't just do that. You might actually have to get down in the weeds and really kind of fix things with the folks that are doing the work. Because if you don't know that, you can't be inspirational. And if you do know that, there might be times where you have to be more interpersonal. So there's different forms of leadership or different skills to use, not just with different types of leadership jobs, but even within the same job. And I think I'll give you a good example. You know, in the school I'm in right now, we have different departments. And I'll give you two departments. One department, and these are faculty by and large. So, you know, we're in a higher education environment. You know, I have faculty in one department that they, you ask them in the US, we have tenure, and you really do have to help negotiate with faculty kind of any decision that's made. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways because you hear a lot of voices, but it's not something I can just say and they do. So we have a lot of conversations and we'll find a place to go, you know, in terms of our goals that we're looking at. I have another department that's our, basically our Army training department. And these are folks that are in school looking to train to be officers in the military. If I ask them for something, they do it. They don't ask me questions, they just do it. And so there are cultural differences even within a particular school, let's say, where some cultures or subcultures are very used to engaging in dialogue and getting to a point where a vision is created and moving forward. And then there are others, and again, I'm oversimplifying it, but there are others where if you just say, let's do this, what do you think? They say, yeah, we'll do it. And what you want is kind of a little bit more of a balance of both. You want the one department who may be used to just doing it to say sometimes, well, what do you think about this to the leader? And you want others to say, yeah, we'll just do it. So there's not, in both extremes, it's not useful, but you want some balance of both. And that's what we try to strive for. So I think as leaders, you have to understand the culture you're in, the subcultures of your leadership or your organization. And I think in the US, we've learned over time, if you just tell people to do it, it only can go so far and it will only work for so many people. But if you really want to be effective, you actually have to look at other leadership approaches in any given organization.
Ujala has worked with you, and she has always admired your work greatly, and she has seen you as a very effective leader as well. So we have been talking about leadership and the traits that a leader should have. So how does those traits make you effective, or create a culture around you that is effective and that is more productive?
So if it's okay, I do have about a dozen leadership traits that I think are critical for effective leaders. And I'll just kind of quickly go through them, and then I can talk maybe more, we can get in more depth in terms of what those play out in different areas. So we've talked about some already. Empathy, listening, developing an alliance, multiculturally sensitive. That's a fourth leadership trait that's critical, and we've gotten into that a little bit. I think another one that we don't hear a lot about is curious. Leaders have to be curious. We have to have kind of this innate sense of what's really going on here and how can that help our organization move forward. Another important characteristic is someone who can tolerate ambiguity. In other words, you kind of got to just sit around and say, I don't know what the heck's going on. And sometimes that's an easy one because we really don't. But more times than not, taking that stance mentally helps us see things in ways we're not perhaps noticing, and that's critical. The other thing I think is important is to be innovative and creative, that we can't just do things the way we've always done them because we've always done them that way. We need to really think, how can we innovate? How can we create to keep a place really moving forward? Another, I think it was the eighth one I would say, is a calculated risk taker. Someone who can say, okay, here are the risks, here are the benefits, here are the pitfalls. but okay, we're going to go ahead and go forward with this because I think it's a reasonable risk to take given the conditions at hand. And then if things don't go well, you course correct and make a better decision in the future. So you have to learn from your mistakes. The other thing I think it's critical that gets underlooked as people that I've known to be effective leaders is someone who takes an educational or educative stance, which means that employees that you work with, you really do want to educate. If they make mistakes, how can you help them grow? How can you help them learn from their mistakes as you learn from your own? So education, I think, is embedded in good leadership. And a few other characteristics I would say. One is to be meaningfully transparent, meaning you don't want to keep everything close and not known. You want people to know what you're doing. You can't open up the books all the time, but you can certainly give enough that people understand what's happening. And I've already talked about patience. And I think the last one I would say is someone who can be honest and when needed, not help someone move on to another job. So if we have someone who's working in the organization who's just not working out, you want to give them a chance to grow. You want to give them a chance to succeed. But if it's not working out, they need to move on. And sometimes we hold on to people too long, and that's okay maybe as a kind of an inclination, but at some point you need to say, it's just not working here. And I think that's important too, is to be able to gatekeep, what I call gatekeeping, but also help move forward. So those are some characteristics. So I think you have to play with all of those, depending on the decision, depending on the stage of the organization, the stage of your leadership. When I enter new leadership positions, I would say the critical pieces are listening and learning. That's what you need to do when you're first a leader. If you come in and say, we're going to do it this way, this way, this way, without understanding who the people are that you're working with, you're not going to get as far as if you just step back and listen and learn in your first phase.
That's asking a lot from a person. I'll rather do a different job. I'll be like, I'll do something that does not involve me to be almost superhuman. But so so maybe we can talk about being an effective leader in a little bit. So I'm curious to how do you develop all these habits? How do you, is it practice? Is it going back to the book? Is it like if you come across a decision, like do you look at all the traits and you look at it from different angles, or when you started making big decisions, how did you start doing that?
So I think it is not, so I give you about a dozen characteristics, and you're right. It's not something that everyone has initially when they're a leader. I think you do develop them over time with your own experience and then correcting from mistakes. Some people get put into leadership positions, whether they're ready or not. Most of us, I think, who are leaders got into positions without any real training or any real skill set, other than we probably had a few key skills that said, this person's really competent. Put her or him in a leadership position. Let's get them there and they'll figure it out once they're there. And really that's what happens. And so, one of the things that's understated is that you do have to be comfortable making mistakes and then course correcting in the future. And if you can do that, that's how you begin to learn these other skills. I would not say it's easy to be a risk taker as an initial leader because, you're likely to make much bigger mistakes. The risks might be much bigger because you're not used to it. However, you might have to make some decisions. If you start in a company or a unit of a company, or you're in a law firm where the books are looking bad financially and you need to get out there and get clients, you might be doing things, trying many different things just to be able to succeed. So I think it just depends on the context, of course.
I'm also curious about your background. So you had a very academic background. You did your PhD, and what I've seen is like when you said you don't learn leadership from school or from your degrees. So if somebody has done an MBA or degrees like that, that kind of helps them know a little bit about business and all the aspects, different aspects. But we have seen when you do a PhD, you trained yourself more academically. Everything is very research based. You take your due diligence and then you get things done. But on the other hand, if you are managing people and you're managing departments, everything, like you have to make a lot of decisions in a day. So was it difficult because you had an academic background and a PhD to transition from that to this, and how were you able to do that?
Yeah, I go back to it's really more my psychology training than the academic training, and I would say even the practice-based training. So an MBA is great, a PhD is great. It gives us some skills, some theory, research, but oftentimes there's a wide gap between what we learn in terms of theory and research and what's practically practically occurs. That, you know, these skills I'm talking about, we don't train very much at all in any, whether it's an MBA program or you know, a psychology program or any other communications. I mean, there's a lot of different degrees one can get, of course. But I don't think we really train in these interpersonal skills. And what's interesting, you know, and as in my new role as a president at Oglethorpe University, you know, we're what's called a liberal arts university, and I'm sure you have similar types of universities in Pakistan. But the idea is that you train people to be critical thinkers, critical writing, critical speaking, and so they're citizens of the world. These are common features of liberal arts colleges and universities. And what's important in those types of universities is we actually do train in these interpersonal skills. We do really focus on them. So when you graduate, when we have a student graduate, they end up in a place, they end up in a company, let's say, that where it is valued above and beyond everything else. So when you look at Fortune 500 companies, for example, and I think it was Forbes did this a few years ago, and every couple of years you see these reports come out, that you ask CEOs what they really want from incoming workers. They want these interpersonal skills. They want students, they want graduates who are empathic, who are citizens of the world, who are thinking critically, listening, all the kind of stuff that we talk about in liberal arts, but also is what makes for great leaders, is what CEOs want. So less important, I think, than the degree, for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions. More importantly is what kinds of interpersonal skills people are experiencing and learning. And that's why it's critical to consider these skills. Because if you have the skills, you can be a leader, and you could be a leader in any context, and it could be in any subfield or subgenre of work that you're part of.
So at Blackstone, what we have been doing in the past 3 years here in Pakistan, we've been taking the law curriculum and we've been developing it around student-centered learning, and we've been making activities. I'm not sure if that is to the extent that we have done it. I'm not sure if any other college has done that in the past in higher education. And we are a private institute, so we have a lot of we don't. I can see the importance of talking to the faculty members and getting them on board now, but we were able to kind of like move in that direction swiftly, and we thought that it's very important for students to learn critically, and I think that's one of the features with lawyers as well. They have to develop that ability to think critically, because they have to think from both sides, and then they have to argue their side, and they have to come up and then to apply the law to the facts. That also is a complex matter. I totally agree with the critical thinking part, and that it is very much required in a lot of professions. So coming back to the discussion, you said in your new role, liberal arts college, and you are creating those future leaders. So how do you? So they need to have those critical thinking and other skills, and how do they become effective, and how do they? When they go out in the real world, how do they make change happen?
So a couple of things. One is just going back to your first point about lawyers. Lawyers, that's why we see those skills that you're teaching, for example, at Blackstone School of Law and Business, that you do get a sense of the kinds of skills, or you're helping them develop the kind of skills that makes them successful. That's why we see attorneys and lawyers across multiple fields be successful. So sometimes it's a traditional law firm, But other times, as you know, it could be in politics, it can be in business. You've got, you look at the heads of different companies and you say, they were lawyers. My gosh, how did they know to be a head of a company of whatever, cleaning products these days? That's big on everyone's mind. Well, because they have those kinds of skills that can put them in a leadership position. They're critically thinking, they're interpersonally gifted or skilled. And in a similar way, what you see is, as I was talking earlier about liberal arts colleges and universities, what we're doing is helping students develop those critical skills, those critical thinking, critical writing, interpersonally sensitive, multiculturally sensitive skills. And when you have those skills, those are the ones that propel you forward. Like I said, people don't always look for leadership positions, but they look for people with those skills to be in leadership positions. So you may be a great engineer, or you may be doing some really great work as an engineer, let's say, and then we're like, oh, I think he or she should be leading this team. Why? Because they have the skills, and they usually get those skills from, say, a liberal arts college or university. That's what makes that so compelling. Why liberal arts colleges and universities are so compelling of a place to go to. And then for employers, they want folks from liberal arts colleges and universities because they have those skills that then they can move people into leadership positions in their companies.
So we have a question from Ali Masoom Gardezi, and he's saying there is a saying that leaders are born, they cannot be made. Isn't leadership a characteristic that is embedded in your DNA? Either you are a leader or you are a follower.
I think it's something that is a saying that's certainly been around for quite a long time. I think, as a psychologist, I lean much more into behavioral or kind of the, if you will, nurture versus nature. That I think nature only goes so far. I think socialization plays a huge role in how early socialization as children, but throughout one's lifetime, professional life, that plays a much bigger role than genetics. Mm-hmm. Genetics is such a small percentage of the variance, if you will, in outcome. What matters is interpersonally what we do, what we learn, how we're socialized to be. That's much more critical in terms of what makes for a good leader. There are certainly genetic characteristics or dispositions that you might see early on, but they have to be cultivated, they have to be nurtured, they have to really come out. And what I would argue is you can get most people to be very good leaders if you provide them the skills. Now, some will be better than others, and those little differences may be genetically related, although we're not sure. There's not any evidence for that. But I would say what's much more powerful are the behavioral characteristics and the learning that people go through. And I'll give you a medical example. Diabetes is something that's clearly genetic. We know, not all diabetes, I'm sorry. Much earlier on, many years ago, diabetes, we would control more through behavioral habits when we didn't have the medications. But even though it's a high genetic factor, most of the way we were able to control it is behavioral. We're looking at the pandemic now. What are the primary ways to control the pandemic? Well, we certainly want a vaccine, and we certainly want a treatment that works. But really what's most effective in the early phases is behavioral change. We change our behavior if we don't interact, if we wear masks, and all the things you're hearing about. These are all behavioral changes that will actually help prevent the spread of a virus, which is pretty powerful when you think of how much behavior plays out. And we see this all the time, whether it's in eating habits or smoking, exercise. These are all behavioral things that end up creating physical problems. So physical predispositions are there. I don't want to dismiss them, but much more powerful in most things that we do are behavioral, which is what I think happens for leaders. If we can train them, they can be much more effective. And which is why I said earlier, I talked about this idea of an educative or educational stance of a leader. Mm-hmm. I want a group of people who work for me to be leaders in my organization or in my unit, depending on where I'm at. I think it's critical that we nurture the skills of people who then can become effective leaders themselves and replace me eventually, because you need that group of folks to continue to make their way through. I don't want just people who follow. I really want people who are leaders, and that goes back to even what we were saying much earlier, which is you want people not to be yes people. You want people to actually say what they're thinking, because at the end of the day, you know, we have to, if you have multiple viewpoints, you can actually be very effective as a leader. Now, of course, as a leader, you take credit and blame. So there is that. But there is something also we haven't talked at all about as a leader that I do think is critical, is when there is success, you spread the success. It's not my success. Because truly, if you've done it right, you actually have involved others around you. If you fail, you got to own it as a leader, because the buck does stop with you, and you don't want to spread the failure. You want to say, look, I own it. I made the final decision. How can I learn from this and then get people on board in the future decisions?
Great, great. So I can't stop thinking, so is there a process to this madness, or is it very fluid? Because with most of the jobs, it's good to be in a routine, to follow procedure, policies and processes. But when you are the one making you're with the vision, and you're coming down with where the direction that the organization needs to take. So is it process, or is it fluid? What is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's more like therapy or teaching. It's much more fluid. It's much more dynamic. It's much more in the moment. It's not just sticking to one formula. We can have processes and procedures, and that helps us. But more times than not, if we overly adhere to a process or procedure or a technique, it's going to stymie anything that happens, because it takes away from the innovation and creativity that can happen. When you all started your law school, I'm sure you used your experiences to kind of dictate what you were going to do, but you weren't beholden to only one way. You probably got a lot of different views on how to do it. You learned from what worked and what didn't work as a way to move forward. And that's very fluid, because you can't always predict. And that's another thing about being a leader. You can never predict what's going to happen, what your next leadership challenge is. You can try, but there's an old saying that if you want to make God laugh, plan, because you can't plan for what's about to happen.
So I want to mention this question. So one of the viewers, he's saying that he is visually impaired, and can he be a good leader?
Absolutely. I don't, disability, visual impairment, any kind of disability that's been identified should not preclude anyone from being a great leader. There may be particular things that can't be done. Let's say in the case of someone who's visually impaired, they may not be able to, if they can read or they have some sight. Well, you can't hand them a 50-page document and say, I need to read this in 10 minutes, or skim it and read, and understand it, because they may not have the physical capability. But that's such a minor skill to what a leader does, that if needed, have someone read it and give you if you have good people around you, if that skill is needed in kind of in a moment-to-moment thing, you get someone to help you with that. But by and large, the skills I'm talking about, empathy, listening, a disability status, if you will, should not preclude one from being able to be a very effective leader. In fact, the argument could be made that people who have a type of disability might be more able to be empathic with how others experience the world, because they're used to listening, they're used to understanding a different way of looking at things. In fact, you want people who have a variety of experiences around you, which is why diversity is so important in any workplace, including physical diversity, physical ableness as a diversity.
One skill that I've seen that lacks, even I feel that it lacks in me or the people who work around me or with us, is prioritization. It's like there are so many things that needed to be done. And if you start thinking about what is important, and if one thing is important one day with the changing environment, something else becomes important the next day, and you're not even done with the first thing. So how do you prioritize? How does that happen?
That's a great question. Well, you know, the pandemic has certainly helped us reprioritize, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's begun to make us look at the world and look at our jobs in new and different ways. You know, sometimes we have the privilege of being able to have discussions and think about what we need to do next and really calculate how we have to move forward. In higher ed, we didn't, all of us in the pandemic were affected in any number of different ways, but, you know, from a work standpoint, most of us had to go remote right away, certainly in the US. Well, you didn't have a time to create a committee and spend 6 months deciding what remote would look like. We had to do it within a week, some less and some just barely anymore. So I think it's, you know, you have to look at kind of what are your short-term, long-term goals. If you have a mission and you have core values, anything you do moving forward, it helps you when crisis decisions have to be made because you can use them as guiding principles. That's why sometimes leaders get in trouble when we don't kind of stick to our core values in terms of what's important. That helps with the prioritization. In non-crisis situations, it also can help guide us in terms of prioritizing moving forward.
Thank you. I think that kind of puts the emphasis back on having a mission and sticking and reminding yourself and your whole organization what the mission is. So we've seen, we have had tremendous success with Blackstone, and we have seen the mission changing itself. And I think it can change, and we can adapt to the new mission. So I have a question from one of the student, Nimra Baloch, and she's saying, any suggestion about studying law effectively? So Nimra, we did talk about critical thinking and developing critical thinking while you're studying. And maybe Dr. Ladany can add a bit more to it.
Sure. And can you, Nimra, if you could tell me a little bit more about what you mean by studying law effectively? Like, is that about prioritizing what's the most important or balancing some other thing going on? Is it possible to get some clarification on that?
Okay. So as soon as her comment
she's got to respond. Okay.
So I'll share that. But I think a lot of students in Pakistan, we have this culture of getting good grades and getting higher grades, and so we are not sure why she's struggling with law. She might be doing fine, but she might not be happy with her current grades or current performance. So if you think of getting good grades or understanding the material, so the law judgments are very complex. And then we are studying English law. A lot of our students study English law, and they're in Pakistan, and it's a different culture, which adds another layer of complexity to that.
Sure. I would recommend there's a great podcast. Now, I don't know how much you have to use standardized tests in Pakistan for law schools and other types of things, but there's a great podcast by Malcolm Gladwell called Revisionist History. And then I think in the 4th season, he does a sequence on law school training and what's important. It's really it's fascinating from a standardized test perspective. And what we have learned over time is standardized tests are some of the worst ways to assess folks. And then there's a natural tension between getting good grades and being an effective whatever, in this case, attorney. Being an effective lawyer grades don't necessarily make one an effective lawyer. At the same time, you need good grades in order to get into the kind of positions that allow you to become a lawyer. So it's really turning education a little bit on its head, that we need to relook at how we educate and what we expect of people, especially when it comes to standardized tests and other types of testing that we do. And so sometimes that conflict is, if this is the case here, how important are these grades? How come I'm struggling here, but I really think I'm going to be a good lawyer, even if my grades aren't where they need to be? And I would argue, yeah, that's what we find is the grades are less relevant than a lot of these other skills that we're talking about. Because you can have the best grades in the world, but if you can't listen to your client when he or she comes to talk to you about their concerns and what they want to do in relation to a lawsuit, or if it's a criminal justice situation, it doesn't matter how good a grade you have. And we see this across the board in disciplines, whether it's a physician who may be the brilliant cognitive, he really or she really understands what it's like to be a physician and understands the medical journals. But when they sit down with a patient, they don't know how to communicate with the patient, and they miss symptoms that may lead to a better diagnosis. You see this in with faculty, you see it with administrators, you see it with leaders. I can read all the leadership books in the world and doesn't make me an effective leader. And so I think that if there is that conflict in studying, study to be effective, but don't lose sight on the interpersonal skills that are needed to be an effective lawyer. That would be my overarching advice.
I would like to add a little bit for Nimra that what we do at Blackstone is we provide an environment where students get to work, where students get to discuss the concepts with each other. Then they get to discuss the concepts with some of the international students we have in our classroom through online learning, and then they also get to discuss it with the teacher. So discuss whatever you're learning, teach to a friend, and also learn from your friend, see how they see the concept, and also how you and explain them how you see the concept. So I did got a comment from Nimra. She's saying, I'm a law student and I'm asking about clear concepts, that how can I study effectively to clear the concepts. So I think she's struggling with the difficulty, which is kind of natural. If you're a first-year student, don't blame yourself in your first year of law. Even the University of London doesn't put the burden on you. Out of 4 courses, they're only going to take the highest grade of one of the courses. The rest of the grades are not going to go towards your degree. So would you like to add up a bit to that, if you have to, so like how you did psychology and you did your PhD, if there was a difficult concept, what was your method of understanding a difficult concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think you work through it, and then sometimes you realize you're just not going to get it. As long as it's not a key concept, most of us can get most of the key concepts, but there are some things I didn't do as well on, and that's okay. You can't be, to me, it's forgiving yourself for not having all the knowledge. At the end of the day, though, what you want to be is competent and effective. It doesn't always mean being competent and effective is understanding a concept. Sometimes I got to tell you, and I love what you talked about and how you operate your law school in terms of getting folks to and how they learn. But sometimes what I learned over time, when I read something, and I usually tell this to new faculty or students, that if you're reading something and you don't understand it, oftentimes it's because it wasn't written well. It wasn't because you're not capable. And just because it's in print or in the virtual print, if you will, doesn't mean that it's actually written in a way that can be comprehended. And that was a lesson that was important for me when I would struggle with things. I would talk with a mentor or a faculty member. I'd say, why am I not getting this? And he or she would say, well, it's because it's not written well. It's not comprehensible. And that's something that's an important lesson to have. Now, sometimes you really do want to struggle with something and really want to fight through it, and there can be benefits to doing that. But sometimes it's trying to, and the key is to figure out when it's the former versus when it's the latter.
Thank you so much for your time. I know you have another appointment starting, another meeting starting in 10 minutes. So before I let you go, would you like to share anything that we might not have discussed, or something crucial or critical that you think, or something to close what we have discussed today?
The only thing I would say is, if you want to be a leader, you think you want to be a leader, and you want to help people become successful, please do it. Figure out how to do it and put yourself in those positions to become a great leader. If it's for the benefit of society, for the benefit of moving people forward and making a positive difference in the world, please take the step and try to become that type of leader that you want to be. I really think we sometimes in our world try to stifle people, put people down, put people in their place. My one message would be, don't feel like you have to be put in your place. Put yourself forward and be successful and change the world for the better, no matter what job you have or what position you're in.
Thank you so much for your time. It's always amazing talking to you, and I think I got 1 hour of your time, and I learned so much. So that was great. Thank you very much, and
It's great to see you.
Have a wonderful day. Great to see you. All right.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.